I long for a world where souls actively seek out the truth and buy into something privilege could never afford. I long for the chance to exist, free of society's silent plea for me to explain and defend my culture, my body, my worth, my own self. Are these things not deserving of the carefree, gone with the wind, I woke up like this taste of freedom that my privileged friends have always known? Liberty, coupled with fear of becoming a hashtag, doesn't feel like freedom at all. This don't feel like freedom at all. If we stop loving on our own terms, God will heal our wounds. God will heal our wounds. If we stop loving on our own terms, grace will lead us home. Grace will lead us home. I long for the day when tokenism is deemed unacceptable, illegal, even sinful to the human psyche. A day when I can be me and you can be you. A day when money and power don't pose as the ultimate threat to human decency and dignity, but is instead used to level every playing field. I long for the day when individuality is the dissonant chord that offers new meaning, excitement, and intrigue. I long for a world I may never see. If we stop loving on our own terms, God will heal our wounds. God will heal our wounds. If we stop loving on our own terms, grace will lead us home. Grace will lead us home. If we stop loving on our own terms, God will heal our wounds. God will heal our wounds. If we stop loving on our own terms, grace will lead us home. Grace will lead us home.
Good morning, church, on this first Sunday of Christmas. After visiting South Africa a number of times in the 1990s, I finally moved there in the early 2000s. I was no longer a visitor. It's different living in a foreign country than it is visiting a foreign country. You pick up much more of the culture, the customs, and the language simply because you're exposed to more. Well, a day came when I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was accepted into the Black community. A group of us were standing around in a circle chatting, and Andiswa casually put her hand not on my shoulder, but about here, and rested it there for an extraordinary, uncomfortable amount of time. Even though she wasn't looking at me or talking to me per se, I'd never seen her do that with any of the other white women around. Well, then after some time, I was also greeted by my good friends Bongiwe and Miranda by kisses on the lips. Well, again, not something I was used to unless you're family. So it was a different custom, but the language told me I was accepted. I was one of them. I didn't feel like so much of an outsider. Well, unlike my experience in South Africa, none of the Israelites wanted to be in Babylon. This was not some spring break road trip or gap year spree. They didn't choose to go. They were forced, sent there by the Almighty of the universe due to their flagrant disobedience. The Babylonian exile meant new languages, awkward customs, never quite understanding, perpetual cluelessness, and always being on the outside of inside jokes. Being in exile is so profoundly all-encompassing that that's what you're even called, an exile. It would never be home for them, never. They'd always be known as those exiles or those foreigners. Our Isaiah passage today is, of course, the very same passage that inaugurates Jesus' foray into public ministry. It's the passage he reads in the synagogue in Luke chapter 4. So can you imagine being in the crowd that day after hearing him say, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me," so on and so forth. And then to hear, "Today this reading has been fulfilled in your hearing." This is not some nice wishful thinking prophecy. What you have longed for, what your father longed for, what your ancestors before have longed for, I have come to do and to be. The Word was God, the Word was with God, the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The prophecies in Isaiah long ago foretold to a people forlorn and longing for home are finally fulfilled in the coming of Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us. Well, Isaiah prophesies to the people of God who had rejected the one who had delivered them from slavery. It's like biting the hand that fed them. They wanted to be like their neighbors, have their gods, small g, because, there's so many of them and just having one is so boring. They wanted to eat interesting food, have kings, plural, not just one king. So God let them have their way and sent them into exile, into a foreign country. Well, thanks God, that's not exactly what we were hoping for. Well, while in Babylon, they wrote songs like this. "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and there we wept when we remembered Zion, our home." That's from Psalm 137. They had a longing for Zion, for Israel, for home. They remembered how things had been. That's how you are when you're in a foreign country for a long time. You remember how things were. You remember home. And they longed to return. A longing to have things made right. Sound familiar? Some of us have experienced those longings this year. I chose to open my sermon today with a beautiful song by Common Hymnal. I think the narrator's longing, an African American living today in the U.S., helps connect to the longing someone living in exile might feel. This year we have suffered as a people, as a global community. Some of us have had to suffer more than others, but we have all suffered. We've been disconnected from loved ones, isolated, living in a perpetual state of unknowing, of wait and see, of delayed gratification, just wondering when. Some of my Asian American friends have suffered ridicule, even being victims of violence due in part to the most powerful and dangerous man in the world blaming the virus on China. Our Black and brown sisters and brothers finally had more than a handful join them to stop racially profiled violence brought on them by those meant to protect. We joined for a few days, maybe a week. We longed to connect to our loved ones, to touch, to hug. We longed to walk outside safely. We longed for our children to be safe enough to grow up and have children of their own. We longed to just be ourselves. And into a hurting, longing, O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel world, comes these words from Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the poor, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to provide for those who mourn in Zion, to give them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the mantle of praise instead of despair. This is a stunning picture of the Anointed One. First, we're told why he is anointed and what the results of the anointing will be. He came to preach good news to the poor, the downtrodden, the disadvantaged, the marginalized, those on the fringes, those held back from progress. Those who only ever get bad news will have good news. To bind up the brokenhearted. Here we see the personal attention of the Anointed One, soothing and healing, restoring. This phrase I have prayed more than once in my prayer pods this year. And proclaim freedom, liberty to those who are held captive by a system that does not work for them. Freedom from bondage that is imposed by people or place. Those who are housing insecure or food insecure. Freedom. They will have freedom. The Anointed One will remove every cause of sorrow, including those who brought the sorrow. Tucked away in the midst of all these good and wondrous gifts is the fact that the Anointed One will also proclaim the day of vengeance. It's the one sort of bad news thing in the whole. The evil and unjust will be held accountable. God cannot be good if he doesn't judge what is aimed against him, his people, and his purposes in the world. Vengeance meted out on the unjust is good news for the oppressed, for the poor. It means that they matter, that God fights for them, that they are seen, that their cries are heard. In the passage, I see 3 insteads in verse 3. Instead, it's like a holy exchange, a replacement, a substitution, if you will. A crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, and a mantle of praise instead of despair. Think of the juxtaposition of these words. They're opposites. When you were mourning, you would often put ashes on your head. And so instead of the ashes being on your head, you'd have a crown of beauty on your head. Can you imagine anything so different than praising while you're in despair? This is what the Anointed One brings. This holy exchange. We see in this text that those who have been delivered will have a new name and status. They'll be recognized as different. The text says they will be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord to display his glory. Funny, the transformation is so complete that those who were sent into exile because of unrighteousness now will be called oaks of righteousness. So righteous that they are large and strong like an oak tree. A new nature with new potential. This is the Lord's doing. A planting of the Lord, not something that they concocted themselves or managed or pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. This is the Lord's doing. Well, those who've been restored and transformed will also bring restoration themselves. Listen to this. They shall build up the ancient ruins. They shall raise up the former devastations. They will repair the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations. You see, those who were exiles become the harbingers of hope. The nobodies, the forgotten, those exiles, are used to restore what was lost. And this message comes down to us as well today, that we are those who join in with God in bringing restoration in the world. Listen to how their situation will be changed as the Anointed One comes. Strangers shall stand and feed your flocks. Foreigners shall till your land and dress your vines. But you shall be called priests of the Lord. You shall be named ministers of our God. You shall enjoy the wealth of the nations, and in their riches you shall glory. Because their shame was double, and dishonor was proclaimed as their lot, therefore they shall possess a double portion. Everlasting joy shall be theirs. Did you hear that? Did you hear that text? Because 12 times I heard the word shall or will. 12 times in 4.5 verses. We live in a world of not yet, maybe, we'll see, perhaps, not sure when, could be. When will this coronavirus be over? When will I have job security? When will it be safe to hug my friend, my family, my loved ones? Will I ever have someone love me, choose me? When will I feel safe? When will Black and brown people stop being killed? When will Asian Americans quit having to answer what country they're from? In a world racked with uncertainty, with question marks, God comes with his shall and his will, with his promise, not the empty promise of a politician seducing you for your vote. But God comes through with his promise. You can take him at his word. His word, yes, the word that became flesh and dwelt among us. God with us, and not just among us, but living in us. This section finishes with everlasting joy shall be theirs. Imagine that. Joy that never runs out. Methinks the joy could be related to that God with us being in us. God will heal our wounds. God will heal our wounds. Make no mistake, a day will come when God will set all things right, when the wrongs of the world will be overturned. This is what I heard from my South African sisters and brothers as they struggled through the end of apartheid. This is the truth that carried many of the faithful slaves singing to God, believing and trusting, believing despite what they saw and experienced, that God will heal their wounds, that grace will lead them home. In the song, Common Hymnal says, I long for a world I may never see. God has the long view in mind. Can we still hold on to our longings, believing that God shall and will, even if our longings are not realized until the next generation or the one after that? The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it. God's shall and will are indelible, everlasting, unchanging. He took on human flesh to prove it. So let's continue to celebrate the incarnation of Jesus, the Anointed One, coming to proclaim good news to the poor, binding up the brokenhearted, proclaiming freedom. Fleming Rutledge writes in her tremendous book, Advent, in the very midst of our human selfishness, the waylaying love of God has broken through to us unconditionally. Was this not the very same message given to those sent into exile? Though you have sinned, I will bring you back. Though you have sinned, I will give you a double portion of grace and mercy. God, in his magnificent mercy, chooses to send one who will comfort those who mourn and set praise in the hearts of those who have been despairing. As I prepared this week, I was reminded of the third verse from O Little Town of Bethlehem. How silently, the wondrous gift is given, so God imparts to human hearts the blessings of his heaven. No ear may hear his coming, but in this world of sin, where meek souls will receive him, still the dear Christ enters in. But in this world of sin, where meek souls receive him, still the dear Christ enters in. If we stop loving on our own terms, grace will lead us home. Grace will lead us home. The dear Christ makes his home in each of us. Maybe what we need more of in this world, more of on the Upper West Side, in Jersey City, is meek souls to receive him. Perhaps that will help us get through this winter. Meek souls to receive him. That's the sort of world I'm longing for. How about you?